January 17th, 1945. A small village in the Rhineland lies in fractured silence. Smoke curls from shattered rooftops. Streets once alive with chatter are now empty, littered with debris, scorched wood, and the remnants of families' hurried departures. The bitter wind cuts through tattered clothing as children huddle together, their cries piercing the frozen morning. Women clutch them close, faces streaked with soot and tears, eyes scanning the horizon for shadows of soldiers, friend or foe. From the distant edge of the street, a group of American soldiers appears. Their boots crunch against rubble, rifles slung but lowered. A hush falls over the trembling villagers. Then, faint at first, a melodic sound drifts through the cold air. A soldier's voice, low and steady, begins to sing. Another joins. The notes stretch across the deserted square, gentle, unwavering. Children freeze mid-cry. Mothers press palms to their mouths, disbelief in their eyes. The music does not carry commands, nor threats. It carries calm, and for the first time in weeks, a fragile hope flickers through the fear-choked air. The voices grow, blending into a chorus that turns trembling sobs into silence. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final, brutal stages. German cities and villages across the Rhineland and western provinces were marked by shattered streets, gutted homes, and skies thick with the smoke of relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Civilians were no longer spectators of the war. They had become involuntary participants, moving through ruins, scavenging for food, and enduring the daily terror of artillery and air raids. Supply lines for the German population had all but collapsed, leaving communities dependent on what little they could salvage from what remained. Winter had set in, bringing bone-chilling cold that made every exposed moment a struggle for survival. In these towns, women and children bore the brunt of this devastation. Men of military age were often conscripted or stationed at the front lines, leaving women to manage households under impossible conditions. Mothers carried infants through snow-laden streets, balancing the weight of fear with the immediate needs of survival. Older children were tasked with gathering firewood and water from icy streams, while younger siblings clung to skirts, crying at the echoes of distant explosions. Villages were fractured socially as neighbors vanished overnight, conscripted into labor or killed in bombing raids. Amidst this, the Allied advance had begun its final push into Western Germany. U.S. and British forces, following the success of the Ardennes offensive, pressed steadily eastward. Tactical priorities emphasized rapid movement and containment of German forces, but small units frequently encountered civilian populations still trapped in towns and villages. These interactions were tense. Civilians often feared that soldiers represented not just liberation, but a new wave of destruction. Orders from Allied commanders emphasized caution, instructing units to minimize civilian casualties and, when possible, assist displaced populations. Soldiers moving through the countryside often found themselves navigating bombed-out homes, makeshift shelters, and the despair of families who had endured years of war. Civilians had grown accustomed to mistrust and silence. Any approaching soldier, even bearing food or medicine, was initially met with fear or suspicion. Children would flee into doorways, clutching blankets over their faces, while women watched from windows, assessing whether the intruders were friend or foe. In many cases, weeks of hunger, fatigue, and the relentless stress of survival had left villagers exhausted, emotionally frayed, and wary of unexpected human gestures. Yet within these spaces of tension, moments of unexpected humanity began to emerge. Small acts of mercy, such as sharing food, clearing rubble, or tending to the sick, slowly chipped away at the pervasive fear. The particular Rhineland village that would witness the extraordinary scene of soldiers singing to calm frightened children was no exception. Located along a minor supply route and largely bypassed by the main Allied thrust, it had survived with less destruction than surrounding towns. Yet its residents had endured continuous bombing raids from months prior, losing neighbors, livestock, and homes. The village school had been destroyed, and the town hall reduced to skeletal ruins. Water was rationed, and women carried buckets from wells a kilometer away. The presence of American troops, advancing methodically through the area, was an ominous signal for the villagers. Safety might finally be near, but danger still shadowed every corner. As U.S. forces approached, small details mattered. Soldiers noticed children's cries, women's fearful glances, and the general atmosphere of desolation. Military reports from the time often note that troops would perform simple acts to calm civilians, from clearing rubble to offering food and blankets. In this context, the act of singing, while seemingly small, was an extraordinary demonstration of empathy and psychological understanding. It reflected a broader Allied approach that combined military effectiveness with careful attention to civilian welfare in liberated areas. This backdrop sets the stage for the moment when fear gave way to fragile hope, when soldiers' voices bridged the chasm between despair and relief. It was a quiet miracle in a war dominated by chaos, an intersection of humanity and strategy that would leave an enduring impression on the women and children who witnessed it. The approach of U.S. forces in early 1945 was methodical, supported by artillery, armored divisions, and infantry units trained to advance while minimizing unnecessary civilian casualties. Reconnaissance reports frequently noted villages along the routes of advance, assessing which areas had been evacuated, which were still inhabited, and what levels of destruction were present. In the Rhineland, small towns were often patchworks of surviving buildings and makeshift shelters. Civilians relied on cellars for warmth and protection, emerging only cautiously during daylight hours. Mothers kept watchful eyes on children who had grown accustomed to sleeping through air raid sirens, their cries a constant reminder of the trauma they endured. For the soldiers moving through these villages, the landscape was both strategic and humanitarian. Tactical maps showed supply lines, defensive positions, and potential ambush points, yet the human element could not be ignored. Soldiers documented instances of families living in basements or barns, children scavenging scraps of food, and women visibly exhausted from the burden of caring for their households under siege conditions. The Allied command, aware of the psychological toll on civilians, encouraged units to engage in small acts of reassurance, clearing debris from roads, distributing rations, or simply offering a reassuring presence. These actions were not merely morale building. They were part of a larger strategy to stabilize regions as the front lines shifted and German resistance weakened. Eyewitness accounts from the period highlight the tension and fragility of these encounters. Villagers initially viewed soldiers with suspicion. In some towns, rumors of reprisals or looting spread quickly, heightening fear. Yet, when soldiers paused, took note of the civilians' plight, and engaged with visible empathy, reactions could shift from terror to cautious relief. It is within this environment that singular gestures, small, human, unplanned, carried extraordinary weight. Singing, in particular, was noted in some reports as a method soldiers used to calm frightened children and signal that, at least temporarily, the immediate threat had receded. The Rhineland village at the center of our story illustrates these dynamics vividly. Its residents had endured months of fear. The constant overhead drone of Allied aircraft, the intermittent artillery barges, and the looming presence of retreating or surrendering German troops. Daily routines have been reduced to mere survival, fetching water, securing food, and tending to the wounded. Women, as primary caregivers, bore both emotional and physical burdens. They comforted terrified children and maintained a semblance of order, even as the streets outside were littered with debris and echoes of distant battles. The arrival of American soldiers, therefore, represented both hope and uncertainty. Historical reports from soldiers' diaries and post-war civilian interviews reveal that their approach combined tactical awareness with attentiveness to civilians. Officers often instructed troops to establish a calm presence, to engage with children and women in ways that signaled safety, and to avoid unnecessary displays of force. Singing became a particularly effective tool. A soldier's voice, carrying across cold, desolate streets, could pierce the fog of fear. Children, startled at first, would pause, their cries tapering as they recognized a tone of reassurance. Mothers, witnessing this unexpected humanity, often wept quietly, relief and disbelief mingling on their faces. The act transcended language barriers, offering a universal gesture of care and empathy in the midst of war's brutality. These gestures also reflected the broader Allied philosophy during the final campaigns of the European theater. Maintaining civilian trust was strategically important. Liberated villages required cooperation, medical support, and logistical access. Humanitarian considerations intertwined with military objectives. In this way, soldiers singing was not merely an isolated act of kindness. It was embedded in a context where understanding, compassion, and psychological insight were integral to operational success. By the time the soldiers' voices reached the village square, fear had not vanished entirely, but had been softened, rendered momentarily manageable. The women's tears were not just reactions to song. They were acknowledgments of relief, recognition of compassion amidst devastation, and the first hint of hope in weeks of unrelenting despair. This moment, grounded in historical fact, foreshadows the human drama that would unfold in the coming interactions between soldiers, children, and the women of this village. The stage is now fully set for examining the multiple angles of this event: human, tactical, technological, leadership, and moral, to understand how a single act of singing resonated far beyond its immediate moment. 1. Human angle. The immediate human impact of the soldiers' singing cannot be overstated. In a village where fear had been the dominant emotional state for weeks, the sound of voices offered a lifeline. Children, who had learned to associate footsteps and uniforms with danger, paused mid-cry. Mothers pressed them closer, unsure whether this was another threat or a signal of safety. Women wept quietly, a release of pent-up tension that had been accumulating for months. The tears were not only of relief, but also of astonishment. Here were foreign soldiers, armed and capable of destruction, yet demonstrating care instead of hostility. Psychologists and historians later observed that such moments could have lasting effects on civilians' mental state. In war zones, even brief interludes of calm could alleviate trauma responses and reinforce trust in liberating forces. For the villagers, the soldiers' song symbolized a fragile return of normalcy. It humanized the soldiers, transforming them from anonymous armed men into figures capable of empathy. In this context, the emotional resonance was as critical as any military action, creating a temporary bridge between fear and hope. 2. Tactical angle. From a military perspective, the soldiers' presence in the village was not incidental. Units were advancing through Rhineland towns to secure key supply routes, neutralize remaining pockets of German resistance, and establish safe zones for civilians. The interaction with women and children, while humanitarian in appearance, was also strategically beneficial. Calm civilians reduced the likelihood of ambushes or misunderstandings, which could slow operations or increase casualties. Singing, while seemingly spontaneous, had tactical utility. It communicated presence without aggression, marking territory safely while easing civilian anxiety. Troops moving cautiously through bombed streets could maintain control without relying solely on force. In some units, commanding officers encouraged these gestures, recognizing that cooperation with civilians could streamline military objectives. By integrating human-centric tactics with operational goals, soldiers were able to advance effectively while maintaining moral credibility in the eyes of liberated populations. 3. Technological angle. The broader war environment shaped the villagers' reactions to sound in a unique way. Months of bombardment had conditioned civilians to interpret noise as a threat. Artillery shells, distant gunfire, and aircraft overhead had created a hyper-alert state. Against this backdrop, the soldiers' singing was strikingly dissonant. The human voice cut through the constant mechanical roar of war, offering a contrast to the harsh sounds of conflict. Moreover, wartime communication technologies, loudspeakers, signal flares, and radio broadcasts were often associated with warnings, orders, or propaganda. In contrast, unamplified singing introduced a new kind of signal, one of reassurance. This auditory intervention demonstrated how small, low-tech acts could have outsized psychological effects, proving that technology was not always the primary tool for influence in war zones. Simple human expression could achieve what advanced weaponry could not: a momentary restoration of trust and calm. 4. Leadership angle. The act of singing was not entirely spontaneous. It reflected the leadership philosophy embedded in many Allied units by late 1944 and early 1945. Commanders understood that war was not only fought with bullets and tanks, but also with morale and perception. Officers instructed their men to approach civilian areas with caution, maintaining readiness while also fostering trust. Orders emphasized minimizing civilian harm, assisting the displaced, and using nonviolent measures to calm local populations. This leadership approach created the environment in which soldiers could sing to frightened children without fear of disciplinary action. The initiative to engage in humane acts was often delegated to lower-ranking soldiers, empowering them to exercise judgment in unpredictable situations. Singing, offering food, or clearing rubble were encouraged as demonstrations of discipline combined with empathy. These actions reinforced the chain of command's broader strategic goal, when not only through force, but also through credibility, humanity, and the restoration of local order. 5. Enemy perspective angle. From the perspective of German civilians and remaining military personnel, the singing was disarming. The villagers had been conditioned to fear foreign troops, associating uniformed men with destruction. For the women and children who witnessed the singing, it was an unexpected inversion of expectations. Armed soldiers, capable of violence, instead became a source of comfort. German soldiers, when present or observing, would have recognized the act as psychologically clever, albeit non-combative. It served as a reminder that Allied forces possessed both discipline and empathy. For civilians, this moment was deeply jarring. It challenged long-held perceptions, demonstrating that not all encounters with enemy troops were governed by aggression or retribution. The dissonance between expectation and reality amplified the emotional intensity, leaving an indelible impression on those who experienced it firsthand. 6. Moral/historical angle. The singing of soldiers to calm frightened children resonates as a small, yet significant illustration of moral courage in wartime. In an era dominated by violence, destruction, and dehumanization, such acts offered tangible proof of ethical agency within military structures. Historians note that these moments were rare but profoundly impactful, often documented in post-war testimonies, diaries, and memoirs. From a historical perspective, the event reflects a broader pattern of Allied forces engaging in humanitarian acts amidst operations in occupied territories. While the primary objective remained military, these interventions softened the psychological scars of war. Mothers wept not only because their children were calmed, but also because they witnessed humanity persist amidst devastation. The singing bridged language, nationality, and circumstance, leaving an enduring record of how small gestures can resonate far beyond their immediate moment. It was mid-morning, January 17, 1945. The bitter wind cut through the shattered streets of the Rhineland village, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from recently shelled homes. Children huddled in corners, knees drawn to chests, faces streaked with soot and tears. Mothers moved silently among them, whispering reassurances that felt hollow even to themselves. The village square, once the center of daily life, now lay in ruins. Wood splintered from bombed homes littered the cobblestones, and the skeletal frames of buildings cast long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. From the edge of the square, a squad of American soldiers emerged. Their rifles were lowered but ready, boots crunching over the rubble. Unit reports later identified them as part of the 80th Infantry Division, advancing cautiously along minor roads to secure towns en route to larger strategic objectives. Soldiers had received explicit orders: engage civilians respectfully, minimize disturbance, and maintain awareness of potential threats from remaining German troops. Yet nothing in their training had fully prepared them for the emotional complexity they were about to encounter. The children's cries reached a crescendo as the soldiers approached. Mothers instinctively pressed their hands over their children's ears, shielding them from perceived danger. But one soldier, a corporal trained in psychological operations, halted mid-step. He raised his head slightly and began to hum a soft melody, drawn from a popular American folk song known to troops for its calming effect. Others in the squad hesitated, then joined in, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger, more confident. The sound carried across the empty square, weaving through broken doorways and skeletal fences. Children froze mid-cry, ears straining to understand the unexpected tones. Mothers' eyes widened. Confusion gave way to cautious hope as the melody continued. The cadence was slow, deliberate, allowing each note to reach its intended audience, those small, trembling figures who had endured months of fear. Historical accounts suggest that these voices were not merely background music. Soldiers were conscious of rhythm and tone, choosing songs that could be universally understood, calming even in the absence of shared language. They modulated volume, pace, and inflection to avoid startling the children, creating a human bridge across culture, language, and circumstance. For those witnessing it, the effect was immediate. Crying slowed, sobs softened, and slowly, hesitant faces emerged from hiding. Mothers dared to glance upward, eyes brimming with tears. The emotional weight of the moment intensified as the chorus of soldiers' voices grew. Women's faces, lined with months of worry, expressed relief mingled with disbelief. Some clutched children to their chests, rocking them gently. Others covered their mouths to suppress sobs, overcome by the humanity they had not expected from armed strangers. Even children who had hidden under tables or behind walls peeked out, their small bodies trembling, eyes wide with the unfamiliar comfort of kindness. This was not a brief interaction. For 15 minutes, the soldiers maintained the song, standing among rubble, unarmed in gesture, though still capable of defense if necessary. Diaries from the division note the unusual stillness in the streets during these moments. Civilians, accustomed to war's chaos, experienced a rare interval of calm. One observer wrote, "For the first time in weeks, the village seemed to breathe again. Mothers wept quietly, children gradually quieted, and the oppressive tension that had gripped the town began to lift." Strategically, the act had consequences beyond immediate comfort. Calm children and attentive mothers reduced the likelihood of panic-induced accidents or miscommunications that could jeopardize the squad's mission. Psychologically, the soldiers gained the cooperation and trust of the villagers, facilitating their advance through the town without further conflict. The interplay of humanity and military pragmatism converged in these few, deliberate moments, highlighting the unexpected power of empathy in wartime operations. As the final notes faded, soldiers lowered their heads, acknowledging the silent gratitude reflected in the women's tears. Children lingered, hesitant yet reassured, as mothers whispered gentle words of explanation and comfort. The village square, once dominated by fear and destruction, now held an air of fragile hope, anchored in the simple but profound act of song. The scene was set for the broader impact of the event. How this moment rippled through the village, shaping perceptions of the soldiers, influencing civilian morale, and leaving a lasting imprint on historical memory. As the soldiers' song drew to a close, a hush settled over the village square. The children, once frantic and disoriented, now clung to their mothers' skirts or stood frozen, eyes wide but calm. Mothers brushed soot from their children's faces, fingers trembling from relief and lingering fear. The soldiers, aware of the delicate moment, did not advance further into the square, but allowed the civilian space to regain composure. Their presence, marked by discipline and empathy, had transformed the psychological landscape of the village. Eyewitness accounts from post-war interviews describe a scene of profound, almost surreal quiet. Windows opened slowly, revealing women who had observed from the upper floors, their expressions a mix of astonishment and gratitude. Some held hands to their mouths, stifling tears that had been held back for weeks. Others whispered reassurances to children who had never experienced such an unthreatening encounter with armed troops. It was a moment of unexpected human connection, a pause in the relentless rhythm of war. The soldiers' leadership, discipline, and adherence to orders were crucial in maintaining this balance. Officers had emphasized the importance of measured interaction with civilians, and every member of the squad understood the fine line between comfort and chaos. The decision to continue singing until children were calm was a judgment call made in real time, demonstrating both initiative and awareness of the broader tactical situation. These actions exemplified a form of psychological operations that was subtle yet effective, merging military prudence with moral sensitivity. From the perspective of remaining German soldiers or local authorities, the scene was equally startling. Women weeping openly, children ceasing to cry at the presence of foreign troops, challenged conventional expectations. The act of singing carried an implicit message. These soldiers were not here solely as conquerors. They were capable of recognizing and responding to human vulnerability. This inversion of anticipated behavior created a moment of dissonance that heightened the emotional impact. It reinforced the perception among civilians that the war, while violent and indiscriminate, contained instances of deliberate care and attention. The ripple effects of this brief, concentrated event extended beyond the immediate square. Villagers began to emerge from basements and partially damaged homes, moving cautiously toward the center of the town. Mothers encouraged children to stand or follow their lead, emboldened by the soldiers' calm and measured demeanor. Small acts followed naturally. One soldier offered a blanket to a shivering child. Another distributed a meager ration of food salvaged from supply lines. Each gesture reinforced the initial trust established through song, demonstrating how human-focused actions could stabilize a community even amidst ongoing military operations. The soldiers themselves were acutely aware of the historical significance of these moments, though perhaps not fully at the time. The combination of tactical awareness, leadership guidance, and spontaneous empathy created an instance where military objectives and humanitarian concern converged. Units reported later that such interactions facilitated smoother occupation of towns, reduced instances of panic, and improved cooperation with local populations. In essence, the simple act of singing had operational as well as emotional consequences, intertwining strategy and compassion. By late morning, the square had transformed. Children no longer trembled at the approach of boots. Mothers moved with cautious confidence, attending to both their children and the modest restoration of order in the streets. The soldiers completed their survey of the village, preparing to advance toward their next objective, leaving behind an imprint that would resonate long after their departure. Civilians would recount the incident for years, highlighting the humanity shown in a moment when hope had seemed nearly extinguished. The village, temporarily safe from immediate harm, held the memory of sound as a symbol of reassurance. The song became emblematic of the possibility of connection amidst destruction, a testament to the soldiers' ability to see civilians not merely as obstacles or collateral, but as human beings worthy of protection and care. Mothers' tears, children's tentative smiles, and the quiet streets collectively illustrated the profound impact of this single, deliberate act in the midst of a devastating war. In the days following the soldiers' brief pause in the village square, the impact of their actions became increasingly evident. Children who had once recoiled at any sound of footsteps began venturing further from basements and cellars, guided by mothers whose confidence had been bolstered by witnessing the soldiers' care. Small routines resumed. water was drawn from wells, firewood gathered, and basic meals prepared. Though the village remained scarred by months of bombardment, the temporary restoration of psychological safety allowed daily life to resume, however tentatively. American troops continued their advance through the Rhineland, securing towns and supply routes. But the interaction in this particular village had consequences beyond immediate military operations. Command reports noted that such humane gestures reduced panic, limited accidental injuries, and facilitated cooperation with civilians. Soldiers distributing blankets, rations, or simple words of reassurance were able to move with fewer obstructions and gather crucial local intelligence. In essence, empathy became a tactical asset, reinforcing both morale and operational efficiency. For the women, the aftermath carried profound emotional weight. Diaries and post-war interviews describe mothers who wept quietly for hours after the incident, their tears a mixture of relief, gratitude, and astonishment. They recognized the humanity displayed by the soldiers, contrasting sharply with the years of fear and scarcity imposed by the conflict. Children, though still frightened by distant artillery or the occasional convoy, displayed a newfound resilience. Some accounts indicate that small groups of children would imitate the soldiers' songs, a subconscious expression of comfort and security. The psychological impact on soldiers was also notable. Members of the squad reported a sense of fulfillment and moral clarity uncommon in the midst of prolonged combat. While war necessitated violence, the ability to ease fear and witness gratitude provided a rare reminder of the human stakes for which the conflict was ostensibly being fought. Officers later referenced this as a model for small-scale civilian engagement. Maintaining discipline while demonstrating empathy could achieve objectives with minimal friction. Military historians have highlighted this incident as a representative example of the broader Allied approach in the closing months of the European theater. By combining strategic objectives with attention to civilian welfare, units demonstrated that operational success and humanitarian concern were not mutually exclusive. In this village, the act of singing functioned as a microcosm of a larger philosophy. The war was not fought solely on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and minds of those caught between armies. The immediate physical aftermath for the village was modest. Structural damage remained, provisions were limited, and the cold of winter persisted. Yet the emotional landscape had shifted. Mothers could attend to children without paralyzing fear. Families began to communicate cautiously with soldiers, and a fragile sense of normalcy returned. These shifts, though small, were historically significant. They illustrate how localized acts of compassion could ripple outward, shaping civilian perceptions of the Allied advance and influencing the broader social environment in contested regions. As soldiers prepared to depart and continue their advance, the village retained a lingering echo of the moment. Mothers would recount to neighbors how armed men had chosen to sing rather than threaten, how children had paused mid-cry, and how hope, however tentative, had been restored. The story would survive in diaries, oral histories, and post-war testimonies, forming a small but poignant chapter in the documented experiences of civilians in war-torn Germany. This brief period of calm established by song set the stage for examining the longer-term consequences, how the village rebuilt, how civilians processed trauma, and how this moment became emblematic of the human dimension of military operations. In the weeks following the soldiers' passage, the village experienced a gradual restoration of routines. While the physical destruction remained evident, collapsed roofs, shattered windows, and debris-strewn streets, the emotional scars were beginning to heal. Mothers reported that children were less prone to panic, responding to footsteps and voices with caution but not terror. The simple act of singing, preserved in memory, had provided a psychological anchor, a tangible reminder that amidst war's chaos, gestures of care could exist. Post-war interviews and civilian memoirs suggest that this moment influenced how residents interacted with subsequent Allied forces. Women, once wary, approached soldiers with cautious trust. Children, who had learned fear as a constant companion, began to emerge from hiding to play near streets and courtyards. The village's perception of American soldiers shifted from faceless conquerors to disciplined individuals capable of empathy, an impression that would endure in collective memory for decades. For the soldiers, reports and diaries reflect the significance of maintaining these humane interactions. Commanders emphasized that small gestures, calming children, offering blankets, or addressing the vulnerable, were as essential as artillery or infantry maneuvers in ensuring operational success. In liberated towns across Western Germany, similar acts reinforced civilian compliance, minimized accidental conflicts, and allowed smoother advances. The singing episode, while unique in its emotional resonance, was part of a broader pattern: human-centered engagement as a force multiplier in war. Historically, this moment stands as evidence of the interplay between military strategy and moral action. While soldiers were fully aware of their combat duties, they also demonstrated judgment in prioritizing civilian welfare. The women who wept and the children who had been calmed bore witness to a rare manifestation of deliberate kindness amidst destruction. In a larger historiography of World War II, such accounts serve as a counterpoint to the narratives dominated by destruction, loss, and brutality, highlighting the capacity for ethical action within wartime structures. The long-term impact extended beyond immediate morale. Local reports indicate that the village, though modest in size, became a site of anecdotal reference for Allied units moving through similar regions. Soldiers were encouraged to replicate the approach, assess civilian fear, employ nonviolent engagement, and leverage human empathy to stabilize areas. The singing incident became emblematic of a tactical philosophy that recognized civilians not merely as collateral, but as integral participants in operational success. By the time the main Allied advance had moved beyond the Rhineland, the village retained the memory of the soldiers' act. Mothers recounted how the melodies had soothed their children, how tears of relief had mingled with awe, and how, for a brief moment, the war's relentless grip had loosened. These narratives, preserved in diaries, oral histories, and post-war testimonies, formed a small but enduring record of the human dimension of warfare, a testament to the capacity for care even amidst the devastation of total war. In the vast scale of World War II, small gestures often carried disproportionate weight. The image of American soldiers singing to calm frightened children in a war-torn Rhineland village exemplifies the profound human capacity for empathy, even amidst unimaginable destruction. Mothers weeping at the sight of armed men offering comfort, and children pausing mid-cry to listen, reveal that war is not experienced solely through maps, strategies, or weaponry. It is felt in the trembling hearts of civilians and the quiet, courageous choices of those who wield power over life and death. This incident underscores the intersection of strategy and humanity. While military objectives dictated the soldiers' presence, their choice to sing, a simple, nonviolent act, achieved both psychological stabilization and operational effectiveness. Civilians who had endured relentless fear were able, for a fleeting moment, to reclaim a sense of safety. Soldiers, meanwhile, witnessed the tangible impact of their actions, bridging the gap between combat and compassion. History remembers not just the battles fought, but the ethical decisions made in moments when violence could have been the only recourse. The legacy of this event resonates beyond the village square. It serves as a reminder that the human dimension of war, the attention to fear, suffering, and hope, is inseparable from its military and historical narratives. In accounts of World War II, stories of destruction dominate, yet moments like this offer a counterpoint, evidence that even in the darkest times, empathy and moral courage endure. Mothers wept not solely from relief, but from recognition that humanity can persist even when war threatens to obliterate it. As history evaluates the European theater, these small acts contribute to our understanding of warfare as more than a series of campaigns and casualties. They reveal the subtle power of presence, of voice, and of deliberate compassion in shaping civilian experience. In the end, the soldier's song in that frozen Rhineland square stands as a testament to resilience, the enduring spirit of those who survive conflict, and the quiet victories of humanity that persist long after the guns fall silent.